Welcome to Ignite Your Confidence for women in leadership who want to speak up and stand out. I'm your host, Karen Laus. Here you'll get all of the tips and tools that you need to stand out with unshakable confidence. Let's dive into today's episode. Today's topic is how to give feedback. We talked a few episodes back about how to ask for feedback, which I always like to start with because too often most leaders don't actually ask for it. We need to get in a best practice to be doing that regularly. Today is all about how to give feedback. And I know most of us shy away from that because most of us don't like to deal with conflict or even perceived conflict. So the first thing that I want to share with you is a story from my history where I was a new manager. And essentially, I was almost hiding in my cubicle every time that this person was late. And I managed a call center. So what would happen is I would notice she was late. And at a call center, you really can't be late. It is an expectation that you are there to answer the phones at 8 o'clock or whatever time you're scheduled to come in. So I think for most of us, that would make logical sense. And in this case, the problem is I hid behind the need to have a courageous conversation. Although, here's the thing, it didn't have to be a courageous conversation in the beginning. Well, for me, it was, but it didn't have to be. So that's one thing I want to share too, is that a lot of times we have this perceived idea of how the conflict is going to be. And it doesn't even have to be a conflict, but it feels that way. So all of these emotions are running rampant inside of us most of the time. And that was the case for me. So this woman had been late multiple times, and I should have talked to her after she was late the first time, but I didn't. I kept waiting and I would tally mark every time she was late. And then sure enough, what ended up happening a few months later, I had tally marked something like 31 times that she had been late. I talked to my boss, and she wasn't very good either, because she's the one that said, "Oh, that's terrible. We need to get HR on this." So without any prior conversation, we are sitting in this room with my boss, the HR manager, and this employee. Totally. Now, again, I'm not condoning the fact that she was late, but my point here is to talk about myself and my own avoidance of the situation, and my boss's avoidance, and even the HR person. She should have asked, well, have you talked to her about this yet? So here I am basically presenting this written warning to her with all of the times that she's been late. And that was not okay. So if I think about, okay, how would I have done this differently? First of all, I would have had a conversation with her that would not have had to be much courage for most of us. Hey, there's an expectation. You need to be here at 8 a.m. and you weren't. What happened? Of course, you want to give people the benefit of the doubt and understand what happened. But that's the first thing, is to simply have the conversation, at least broach the subject. Now, I know that there are going to be different things that we are looking at, particularly with how we give feedback. So it's a very different situation when someone is a boss of someone else, where there is a job expectation, compared to someone who's a peer that interrupts them all the time at meetings. So we're going to talk a little bit about both of those. Since we're talking about this situation where I was a new manager managing this person, the simplest thing that you could do when something doesn't happen that is a legitimate expectation of the job is to inquire after you make an observation. So I could have said to her, we'll call her Susie, "Hey, Susie, you know that the job expectation is to be here at 8 a.m. So what happened? Tell me what happened." You might get a story or an example that would make logical sense. In the case of my employee, there was always some amazing story that she told. So she would often volunteer why she was late. But the bigger problem is that I didn't actually say that is not okay. A great excuse does not make up for the fact that you need to be here on time. And of course, you want to have grace for people, but there also is a legitimate job expectation that's required. So I think we all know that. And yet a lot of times we do this avoidance thing. So we want to not avoid conversations that we perceive as difficult. They don't have to be difficult, but It's how we feel about the conversation. So that's why it's important that you all feel equipped to have these. So that's one thing, boss to boss, or excuse me, boss to someone who's a direct report. Another situation might be when you're in a meeting, for example, and somebody, let's just take the example of somebody interrupting, and you want to address it. I wouldn't do this after the first time it happened. This is another thing that's important to recognize. In certain situations, you want to be looking at themes. So, for example, what I would suggest is coming to the person. We'll just keep calling these people different names here. So we'll call this person Jody for the fun of it. Let's say Jody continually interrupts you at meetings. What I would suggest is you use my ASS method. It is a formula to help you with this process. And truthfully, this could be used in any situation where you want to offer feedback. And the A stands for ask, the S stands for seek, and then the second S stands for share. So A is ask a question, the second S is seek to understand, and the third S is share your perspective. Notice that your perspective comes after the other two. So I might say something to her like, hey, Jody, I wanted to chat with you for a minute. And I'm not even sure if you're aware of it, but I've noticed this has happened a few times now. So I wanted to have a conversation with you about it. Are you aware at some of the meetings that we have together that you tend to speak when I'm speaking? Sometimes you'll actually interrupt when I'm in the middle of it. That would be your first question. So you're making an observation first. I noticed, or I saw, or I experienced. It just depends on the language that you want to use. But generally speaking, it needs to be something that was observable, a fact that happened. And then, so let's say you say that, and let's say she says back, well, what do you mean? I don't interrupt. Well, my experience was that it felt, and this is where you can take ownership of your own experience to say something like, for me, when I am in the middle of speaking, it's hard for me because I lose my train of thought when somebody interjects. And because she might think, well, I'm actually offering value, or I'm not interrupting, I'm just interjecting, I'm just saying something that relates. And then you could say something like, well, for me, the truth is it's challenging for me when I'm in flow and I'm in the middle of a conversation or a thought, when somebody, even if you were interjecting to add value, I totally get that. And I do appreciate the value that you bring for sure. I would really prefer, because it does tend to throw me off, if you would wait until I'm finished. Would that work for you? And notice here, I'm asking questions throughout. Would that work for you? And I'm trying to avoid saying you this or you that. When you come from a place of curiosity and inquiry, you are going to have a much better result than accusing or going into this, well, you did that, or you did that, or you did this or that. So it's a little challenging to do this in a podcast because I don't have somebody to role play back with me. But let's say that is the case where they just push back and say, well, I'm not interrupting, I'm interjecting, I'm adding value. That's what I would still say to gently. And this is also really important to stay calm, because the same facts that happen can be interpreted very differently. And by the way, a side note, I would highly recommend that you do this exercise that I'm going to share with you before approaching what you would perceive as a difficult or challenging conversation. And that is to make 2 columns, and on one side put facts, the other side put interpretations. It's amazing how short the facts column is compared to the interpretations, because we are human beings and we're multifaceted. So we are probably going to have multiple interpretations of the same fact. So that is also why it's really important to do your best to stick to the facts and observations and how you feel about something. Notice how I said, I have a hard time staying on track when I get interrupted. You're taking ownership of how that comes across to you. So that would be my recommendation for that. If, for example, the alternative is probably what would be more likely to happen, depending upon your audience. But let's say you bring this up and say, hey, Jody, I'm not even sure you realize it, but oftentimes when I'm at meetings, you'll say something or interject, and oftentimes it feels like an interruption to me. And that makes it hard for me because I'm not as able to stay focused with what we're talking about. And she comes back and says something like, oh my gosh, I had no idea I was doing that. And most likely that is what you're probably going to experience. The person just has no idea. Half the time, people are simply not aware of how their actions are affecting others. And that is a whole topic on emotional intelligence that we can deal with another time. But that is really important to be mindful of so that you can recognize that, hey, a lot of times you might be feeling frustrated, but the person has no idea that they're doing that. So in that case, what you want to do after they say, oh, I'm so sorry, I had no idea, to say, hey, well, I have a request. When you're tempted to interject at the next meeting, would you please take a moment and pause and let me finish? That would be greatly appreciated. So that is a way to handle the conversation. If we go back to the second S in share your perspective, another thing that you could say if they feel like, well, that isn't at all my experience, you're not going to argue their experience. You can't. It will not be productive. Because you can't say something that somebody else's experience because it is their experience. What you can do is share your experience and say something like, wow, we have a very different experience here because I perceive that as interrupting, and it definitely threw me off because it's harder for me to stay focused when somebody is adding in or interjecting. And I do think that interjecting has a softer feel to it than interrupting. It really depends on your audience and how direct you want to be with that person. You might have better luck when you're broaching a more challenging conversation with something that's still direct and gets the point across, but without flat out saying, you interrupted me, because that's probably not going to get the best response. So taking ownership of your experience, then you could say, well, I'd like to share my perspective of how I experienced that. Would that be okay with you? That simple ownership of what you want to share and then ask the question is one of the best ways to get it out there, rather than saying, well, I had this experience. When you ask, you come from a place of care, and that will make all the difference when you're trying to influence, particularly in a conflict situation. So let's review that ASS. Ask the question about whatever it is that you're observing. Then the first S is seek to understand. And then the second S is share your perspective. Now, let's talk about what happens when you've got somebody that is a higher authority than you on the ladder in the corporate world, for example. It could even be a client or somebody that you want to make sure that you really handle it in the best way possible. It still can be handled the similar to what we've talked about already. That same method I find works pretty much every time. It's just, what are some of the nuances around it? So let's say you want to talk to your boss about something that hasn't been done on her end, and it's causing backlash, or maybe not backlash, but she's become a bottleneck in your process, but she perhaps doesn't even know that. So you could approach her and say, very similar to what I've done before, let's call this person, let's see, maybe this person could be Suzanne. Okay, let's call this person Suzanne. Hey, Suzanne, I wanted to talk to you about my workload right now. And I know we've got this deadline, and what would be really helpful to me is to make sure that I can get my part of that done. I'm not even sure if you're aware of this, but
there's that part A that needs to be completed. And I'm actually waiting on that from you at this point, at least to my knowledge. That's what I'm waiting on to be able to complete my part of the project. Are you aware of that? And see what she says. She may say, "Oh my gosh, I had no idea." Or she may say, "Oh, yes, I know." Or she may just come back and go, "What are you even talking about?" I mean, there could be a variety of different ways that the person could respond. But notice how I handle that specifically to inquire. You're coming from a place of inquiry. Asking that question is absolutely the first thing that you want to do so that you can find out information. That's what your goal is. You want to find out. You don't want to immediately come with an accusation. So, same thing. If she says, "Wow, I had no idea," then it's similar to the interrupting before. "Well, I'm so glad that we had this conversation because I definitely need that part to be done. Are you okay? When do you think that you could get that to me? Because I know we want to get this thing done and I can finish it as soon as possible, as long as I get that from you." So the other thing that you're doing there is that you are inquiring, but you're also showing the benefit to her. You're you're saying, "Okay, look, we want to get this thing done. The client is waiting on this," or whatever is waiting on this. Procurement is waiting on this. Whatever other department might be waiting on this that matters to that person. That's what's going to help move this forward even more because you're thinking about things through the lens of your audience. We always want to be thinking of things through the lens of our audience and what is going to serve them best. So, those are my tips on how to give feedback. I want to offer a couple of other things. So let's just, first of all, review. Use the ASS method: ask, seek, and share. And then the other thing in general to keep in mind here, folks, is to be calm and breathe. Remember to relax in advance, take a deep breath. You want to make sure that you are relaxed and calm. And remember, this is not about the person. As frustrated as you might be, it's not about the person. It's about the actual thing that is or is not happening. So if you can deal with it from that perspective, if you can look at it through that lens rather than thinking, "I can't believe this person is this or that," think about it from the perspective of this is something that's neutral. A job is neutral. A job description, the roles, the responsibilities that we have. It's when you put the person to it that we start taking things personally or making it personal. So try to extract the person from it and say, "Okay, what is actually the issue here? What is it that I need to look at? And how can I come from that place of really getting to the core of the issue, but caring about the other person, coming from a place of care?" And remember, think that nobody is coming to work thinking, "Oh, I really want to piss people off today." Like that isn't what people come to work for, I hope. People are doing their best and we need to assume best intent. So that's another tip. First of all, stay calm and breathe. Don't take it personally and try not to make it personal as well. And then really focus on remembering that it's about the issue, not about the person. And when we focus on the issue, we can, first of all, also come across as a lot more, we'll just naturally come across as more calm, but it's simply easier to look at things from that perspective. And then the other thing is make sure that you plan this in advance so you know what you want to say, but don't make it some big dramatic conversation. Just say, "Hey, I want to chat with you for a little bit. Do you have a few minutes?" "Oh, well, what's it about?" "Oh, it's about how some thoughts that I have." Here's another tip. Try to avoid using the word feedback because immediately when someone hears feedback, they think it's negative. Start with, "Hey, I've got some input. I've got some thoughts. I've got some ideas about how we can improve efficiency on this project." Something like that. It doesn't have to be that you come on strong with, "I've got a conflict with you," or "I'm really frustrated with you." So that's where I would focus your energy. So those are my tips on how to give feedback. I would love to hear if you have success with this, or if you don't, what happened? Tell me your stories. I want to hear it. And by the way, If you are interested and looking for a speaker for your next event, I would love to be there. I love to focus on having any conversation, and communication is absolutely my number one most thing that I'm an expert in, as well as it's also really fun for me to serve in that capacity. So anything related to communication and confidence, I am there and would love to serve you. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
That's a wrap of another episode of Ignite Your Confidence. I'm your host, Karen Laus. Thank you so much for listening. If you loved today's episode, please subscribe and leave a review. It helps other people find the podcast faster, and it certainly helps me. If you're interested in more tips and tools around confidence, please join me over in my Facebook group called Ignite Your Confidence with Karen Laus. Remember, you too can stand out with unshakable confidence.